All right, shall we begin?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay. Well, go.
Yeah, I'll introduce you for a second here. Thank you so much, everybody who is joining this webinar, the very first webinar of 8. My name is Jos Hummelen. I work for CIDI. We organize this webinar series, especially for students, but for everybody who's interested. Thank you so much for being here with us on this Wednesday morning. You could be anywhere in the world, but you're here with us. So thank you for that. I want to make a quick a shout out to the podcast we make, because it's covering some of the same topics we are doing here. So look up in your podcast app. It's Dutch and it's called Mizrach. So that is M-I-Z-R-A-C-H, Mizrach. It's the CIDI podcast. But today we're not about making a podcast, we're about doing a webinar. And luckily for you, I'm not doing the webinar, I'm just hosting it, because we have a very special guest. He's a professor of the Ben Gurion University in the Negev, so in the south of Israel. And we're going to talk today about the emergence of modern Zionism. And in order to have some interaction with each other, you can ask questions on Facebook, on the webinar, and I'll interrupt Professor Saposnik, if I may, to ask the questions and sometimes wrap it up for you so that we keep you involved. So thank you very much again, both the audience, if you're following this very first webinar of the 8, make sure you watch the other 7 as well. But let's start with Professor Saposnik. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jos. Welcome, everybody. Unfortunately, we're still living in pandemic times, so I can't actually see you face to face. I look forward to having an opportunity to actually be there and conduct a similar seminar live with actual human beings. But we will try to make this as interactive as possible. Quick introductory word. Jos mentioned that I am affiliated with the Ben Gurion University of Negev, and in fact, you can see in my background behind me the Tzin Valley, which is basically virtually in my backyard. We won't be talking too much today about the Negev and its importance in Israeli history and in Zionist thought, but if people are interested in asking questions, we can certainly do that. Let me begin to share my screen and introduce the topic in that way. Okay.
That works.
Yep, my screen is now visible. You can see the emergence of modern Zionism.
Yes.
Wonderful. So let me use this opening screen to make a few introductory remarks. First of all, let me say this. I am by training and by inclination a historian, and you will certainly see that and feel that over the course of this next hour or so. What that means is that my task, excuse me, my task as a historian is to explain change over time, okay? That's what historians do. We try to explain change over time. And to me, and I've spent already at this point a good number of years studying the history of Zionism, one of the most fascinating aspects of it is the dramatic change, the revolutionary change that takes place in Jewish life over a really very short historical time span, right? In the span of about half a century. Very famously, Theodor Herzl, whom you see on the right-hand side of the screen, the person considered in Israel, he's remembered as the visionary of the Jewish state. When the first Zionist Congress in 1897 very famously wrote in his diary that at Basel where the Congress convened, I established the Jewish state, right? And he adds a note. He says, if I said this out loud today, people would laugh at me. But in 50 years, they will see that this is true. And in fact, just about 50 years later, a state was established. Now, to me as a historian, one of the fascinating aspects of this is that at the time that Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress, as he noted in his diary, in fact, it was not just hypothetical that people would laugh at him. Many people, in fact, did. And some of those closest to him suggested that perhaps he should take a vacation because he probably needed it very much, because the idea was not only a radical, but an extremely implausible and almost crazy idea. And I want to start with that notion that there are two central themes in the history of Zionism that were extremely implausible at about that time. One was the establishment of a Jewish state, and the second, perhaps even more implausible, was the creation of a Hebrew culture. We need to remember that no child had been raised speaking Hebrew for about 2 millennia at least, at the time that a few crazy individuals decided to make Hebrew a spoken language and the basis for a Hebrew culture.
Yes, that keeps blowing my mind. That's so unique.
I agree, and you know, it blows my mind. I've been studying this now for, 3 decades. The creation of Hebrew culture is really my main area of interest. And I have to say, it still blows my mind. It really is an almost inconceivable historical development. And what this opening slide does here is to give some indication of what I want us to think about over the next hour or so. As I mentioned, Theodor Herzl, whom we see on our right, is considered the visionary of the Jewish state. If we look to our left, we see a number of those committed and perhaps crazy individuals who decided to actually make that idea, that implausible idea, and turn it into reality. And what I want us to think about is how does that transition take place? How does this implausible idea become a very concrete reality that we're familiar with today over the course, once again, of really a fairly short historical time span, okay? So let me move to my next slide. Okay, and just to stress the implausibility aspect, okay? I want to point to Zionism as a paradox here, okay? And what is the paradox then, or at least one of the paradoxes of Zionism? You know, there's a wonderful quote in my most recent book, by the way, which I'll maybe mention shortly, some of the themes in it. I quote a passage or sentence by the 20th century Jewish theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel, who writes, "To ignore the paradox is to miss the truth." And this is certainly the case when we're dealing with Zionism. And one of the central paradoxes then that I want us to focus on for a moment is the paradox of the connection to the land of Israel. Okay? On the one hand, we can talk about a very deep and intense bond between the Jewish people and the land of Israel that goes back at least as far as the biblical text, right? If we remember our biblical text, the book of Genesis, right? There is a promise made to Abraham, right? That this land will belong to your offspring. Okay? And throughout the centuries, as you can see in the text here, what characterized Jews both in Christian lands and in Muslim lands throughout their lives was not only the fact that they were a religious and ethnic minority, in many places virtually the only religious or ethnic minority, but they were seen by the surrounding societies and saw themselves as a minority in exile. In other words, as a group of people that actually belonged in some sense to some other place. And that other place was that place known in Jewish discourse as the land of Israel. Now, on the other hand, and in a minute I'll talk about all sorts of practices that manifested that bond. But on the other hand, even all of that manifestation, no Jews, or virtually no Jews, for much of that period of many years, had a sense that what that bond meant was that they should change, right? That Jews should actually immigrate to Palestine, as it was known in European discourse, that they should try to establish a state, for example, right? These are very recent ideas. They belong to the 19th century, essentially. And we can talk about some of those tensions then. Okay, so let me say a quick word, however, about what some of the tangible connections were. What were some practices that Jews did maintain that manifested their bond to the land of Israel? So first of all, when Jews prayed, traditional Jews prayed 3 times a day, and in those 3 times a day prayers, they would face the direction of Jerusalem. Right? To this day, that traditional Jew prayer faced the direction of Jerusalem. That they would have mentioned, Yos, at your podcast, the word Mizrach, which in Hebrew means east, is the direction in which Jews in Europe prayed, because that was the direction of Jerusalem, or at least understood to be the direction of Jerusalem. Jews would hang on the walls, usually a picture of Jerusalem, and these pictures were called a Mizrach. Right? They were hung on the eastern wall. Jews would pray in that direction. All sorts of practices. Some Jews, if they could manage to do this, would travel to the land of Israel to be buried there. Okay, so in old age, Jews would travel there. This, of course, before modern transportation in the 19th century, was a very difficult undertaking. So Jews could not do this. But what others would often do is to obtain a little packet of soil from the land of Israel and be buried with that. Okay, so you would be buried with a little packet of soil. So all sorts of practices that manifested this connection. If anybody's ever been, for example, to a Passover Seder, right? At the end of the Passover Seder, every year, the final word is next year in Jerusalem. Okay? Now, we need to remember that for most Jews, when they said next year in Jerusalem at the end of the Passover Seder, they did not usually mean that they would physically relocate themselves to the Passover Seder. They weren't being disingenuous. It meant different things. And here, let me make one final point on this slide. In traditional Jewish discourse, we talk about what is known in Hebrew as Yerushalayim shel Mala and Yerushalayim shel Mata, right? The heavenly Jerusalem and the earthly Jerusalem. And by extension, we can talk about the heavenly land of Israel and the earthly land of Israel, Jerusalem being the manifestation of the land of Israel as a whole. And in different times and at different currents of thought and in different places in Jewish history, there was more stress placed either on the heavenly, in other words, the metaphoric or the spiritual land of Israel, and at other times, in other places, in other streams of thought, on the earthly land of Israel. One of the things we can say about Zionism, as we move into it shortly, is that Zionism, one of its central goals is to bring together these 2 different lands of Israel, right? To make the heavenly and the earthly one once again. Okay? So, but to come back then to the paradox, so we have on the one hand this deep and intense bond between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. On the other hand, most Jews, most of the time, did not think that what that bond meant was that they should change their place of residence. Okay? And once again here, we can talk, and if we want to, when we have time for Q&A, we can go in greater depth into the Jewish connection to the land of Israel and its complexities. Just to give you a little bit of a hint, we see on the left here, this is a rendering by Ephraim Moshe Lilien, who was a Zionist artist at the turn of in the early 20th century. This is, of course, a rendering of the biblical promise to Abraham. And I don't have time to talk about this at great length right now, but even in the biblical text, we can see a tension between the promise of the land and the overarching threat or danger of exile from the land that is built into the promise. And this tension exists throughout Jewish history between promise and land of promise and the threat of exile. And these are going to be the twin poles that inform a great deal of Jewish thought throughout centuries, and certainly a great deal of Zionist thought when we reach the late 19th century.
Question, is it always the actual land, Professor Saposnek, or is it sometimes also the thought of the land? Is it the actual land as displayed on the second picture here, or is it also a sort of Platonian thought?
Yeah, that's an important question. And as I say, there really is a tension. We can talk, I like to think of it almost as a sort of accordion-like movement, right, within Jewish thought throughout centuries, right, where on the one hand, at some times, in some places, in some currents of thought, the emphasis is really on the land, on what I would call the heavenly land of Israel, Yerushalayim Shel Mala, the metaphorical, the spiritual notion of the land of Israel, and not on the physical sand and rocks and soil of the land. At other times, for other people, it is about the physical land. And one of the things that I think characterizes Zionism is this really almost a demand that the two be wedded together once again, that the metaphorical land of Israel and the physical land of Israel become one. Okay. As a footnote to this, I shared there's a wonderful, at this point, a classical article by two scholars named Zali Gurevich and Gidon Aran about place in Jewish thought. And one of the things they argue is that demand, that call in Zionist thought for the physical and the metaphorical lands of Israel to come together never fully manages to be fulfilled, and the tension remains to some extent. There's always the metaphorical land and the physical land that to some extent are at odds with one another, and characterize to some extent Israeli culture to this day, that tension. Okay? So both are there.
Yeah, so if you say next year in Jerusalem, it might be the heavenly Jerusalem, it might be the earthly Jerusalem, or both. You never know what you're saying or wishing for.
Exactly, and and we like to think, and this sort of jump ahead a little bit when we think about what we can call practical Zionism, or the Ben Gurion version of Zionism, right? This notion that all Jews after 1948 certainly ought to live in the state of Israel, right? Some Zionists held this view or hold this view. There were many who, at the time and to this day, who didn't and who don't, right? The notion is you can say next year in Jerusalem and mean it in a very real way, and yet not mean it in the sense that it means you should pack your bags and plan to live in Israel next year, right? And what then it means, these are questions we can address maybe later on when we're question and answer mode more intensely. But yes, exactly. So a sentence like next year in Jerusalem has various layers of meaning to it and can mean different things to different people in different contexts. Okay, so let me make a few points then, some central points on the birth of modern Zionism related to the paradox that I was talking about before. Okay? So an active movement for a Jewish return to Palestine. Let me say a quick word about terminology here. Okay, in the 19th century, we think of Palestine, the word Palestine, as today a politically loaded term. Okay, for historians, it is not. Okay, we simply call this land as it was called. Right? We call it Palestine until May 14th of 1948, when the state of Israel is established. Then we have a state of Israel. The official name of this land under the British mandate was Palestine. Okay? That is how Zionists, non-Zionists, and anti-Zionists all referred to this land before 1948. So when we're talking about the 19th century, it is simply a name for this land. I can talk about the complexities of that name, by the way. It didn't have a clear geographical definition, but we can get into that a little bit later, what some of the complications of the name are. But for current purposes, the name Palestine is simply the name given to this land at the time. And an active movement then for a Jewish return to Palestine really emerges only around the late or mid-19th century. And one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is why? And there are two aspects to this why. Okay? Why does it not emerge earlier, right? If I just claimed that there's a deep Jewish connection to the land of Israel that goes across the centuries, why does an active movement for Jewish return not occur before the late 19th century or mid-19th century? And then the second aspect to that is, well, then why does it appear in the 19th century? Okay? These are both questions we need to try to explain. Okay? I'm going to suggest that at least one of the central classical answers, right, which is the rise of modern exclusivist anti-Semitism in the 19th century. Okay? So many people, if you ask, how do we explain the rise of Zionism, they're given is it is a response to anti-Semitism. I want to suggest that that is really not a sufficient answer. Okay, it's an important part of the picture, but it does not sufficiently explain the rise of modern Zionism. Okay, fundamentally, what I want to suggest is that in order to understand the emergence of an active movement for Jewish return to Palestine, what we call modern Zionism, we need to understand a radical change that takes place in Jewish self-perception. Okay? The ways in which Jews understand themselves changes. It's not just an outside pressure, in other words, with the rise of modern anti-Semitism, but an inside transformation that takes place. Okay. So some additional central questions that we need to try to understand in order to understand this phenomenon we call Zionism. So let me begin by noting that probably the dirtiest word in the Zionist lexicon, okay, is the word exile or the word exilic. And to this day, in Israeli culture, if you want to sort of denigrate somebody, you might call him in Hebrew galuti, exilic, somebody who is of exile. Okay? Now, the word exile is, of course, not a Zionist invention. It's a central idea in Jewish culture throughout the ages. We need to understand the term exile. And what does it mean? And how is the meaning transformed then in the context of modern Zionism? The opposite pole of that, then, question number 2 here, is the relationship to Jewish messianism. Okay? So this is another theme that we find in Jewish thought, again, since biblical times, the notion of a Messiah. Now, there are many, in fact, many notions of a Messiah, and they change over the course of history. And Zionism itself will have a complicated relationship with Jewish messianisms, I would say. Okay? How do we situate Zionism in the context of traditional Jewish messianism? This is a complicated question, which I will hope to at least give some indication about today. Okay, so and you can see my final note on this slide here, Jos, really is related to the question you just asked me, right? The tension between the mythical or the metaphorical land of Israel and the actual land of Israel. Zionism seeks to resolve that tension.
There's also a question about that, and the question is as follows. Does heavenly Jerusalem still could have its place in Zionist ideology?
So the answer, that's a big question, of course.
Yes.
It's hard to give, a simple answer to that, but it's an important question. The easy answer is yes. Okay, and this is related to what I was saying earlier about this famous article by Aran and Gurevich. The land of Israel has its very mundane, quotidian reality, right? We have rocks and stones and soil, and that's the land of Israel. But of course, to this day in Israeli culture, it is much more than rocks and stones and soil. It has textual implications and metaphorical implications and religious implications and all sorts of symbolic implications, whether you are religious or non-religious. And that resonates very strongly to this day in Israeli culture. And I can tell you, it is very much still a part also of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which we can come to later on if we'd like to as well. I'll give you one little hint of what I might suggest if we want to talk about that. And that is that to a large extent, the conflict is in fact over that mythical land of Israel, or the mythical Palestine, right? If we look at the other side, rather than the real estate of it, right? It's not only about where we draw borders. Mm-hmm. It's about meanings, identities, spiritual reverberations, and so forth. And so the easy answer is absolutely yes. Okay? It's very much a part of Israeli culture and very much a part of the conflict. All right, so what I want to suggest, and I'm plugging my most recent book here a little bit as well, but the point is not just to plug the book, but to give you a central idea that I try to advance in it, and that is that Zionism really needs to be understood, in my view, as a movement striving for various kinds of what I've called here secularized redemptions. And I'll come back to the notion of secular in just a minute.
What's the title of the book again?
You can see it right there. This is its cover. It's called Zionism's Redemptions, Images of the Past and Visions of the Future in Jewish Nationalism. And in creating these visions of redemption, Zionism is in dialogue with Jewish redemptive and messianic traditions. Okay? Sometimes a difficult dialogue with Jewish messianic traditions. Christian notions of salvation, okay? Also sometimes a difficult dialogue with Christian notions of salvation, and then also what we can call secular political messianisms. And we can talk more about what that means later on. I promise to leave some time for some more concentrated question and answer. So this tells us something, okay, about at least how I understand Zionism, and this is, of course, I should stress, this is not, written in stone. There are different historians who understand Zionism in different ways, but I would suggest in this context that if we, the dictionary definition of Zionism as the movement aiming at the creation of a Jewish state, as I suggested in the context of anti-Semitism as the cause, that I think it's an insufficient explanation. That is also the case with this definition. Okay? In other words, it's not sufficient to understand Zionism as a movement designed to establish a Jewish state. That's a central aspect of it. But in fact, as I'll give you a little, again, it's a little bit of a preview of where I'm going. Statehood ultimately is, in my view, in much of Zionist thought, much of the time, a means to the end rather than the end itself. The end is a much more ambitious, redemptive vision of various kinds, and we can talk about what those various kinds are. Okay? Questions up until this point? Anything else? Yes.
In the subtitle, it says Jewish nationalism of your book. And Elma has a question about that. She's asking, around the same time that modern Zionism emerged, nationalism emerged in European countries. Is that related?
Excellent question. And it's an excellent question, first of all, on the substance of it. It's also an excellent question because it acts as a wonderful segue for me into my next topic. The answer is it is very, very closely related. Let me say this. I'm a little bit, to be honest, ambivalent about my subtitle there, because I think in many ways Zionism is a variety of Jewish nationalism. I think we can think of it in those terms. But I also think that it's a very complicated phenomenon, and the term itself, again, is not entirely sufficient. Okay, so yes, it's very closely related in all sorts of ways, and I'll talk about what some of those ways are in just a minute. And if I forget to get to some of those points, remind me. Absolutely. So it's related, at least in the sense that in many ways we can say that Zionism really is a form of nationalism. It is a form of Jewish nationalism and will incorporate and be influenced by many of the ideas and images of European nationalism, which is the context in which Zionism emerges. Okay? So absolutely, it's very closely related. In fact, let me say this. European nationalism provides two almost opposite directions of influence on the emergence of Zionism. So on the one hand, it provides a language in which some Jews can rethink about what it means to be Jewish in the modern world. Okay? The context of European nationalism provides a language, right? The language of nationhood. On the other hand, it also has another impact in the sense that over the course of the 19th century, as much of European nationalism moves away from a kind of Mazziniism, sort of Mazzini liberal nationalism toward more exclusivist nationalism, and in some cases anti-Semitic nationalism, and Jews begin to be in many places more excluded from the local nationalism, it also it pushes Jews in the direction of a separate Jewish nationalism. Okay? And there's nobody who's a more perfect illustration of this than Theodor Herzl himself, right? Who, as a young student at the university, is a member of a German nationalist fraternity. He sees himself very much as a German nationalist and a member of the German nation. And as that German nationalist fraternity becomes more anti-Semitic and excludes Jews, Herzl leaves that fraternity, he resigns from it, and embarks on a path of trying to think differently about his Jewishness, and ultimately will become the founder of modern political Zionism. Okay, so nationalism operates, in broadly speaking, in at least those two different ways. Okay. All right. So let me make a little bit of a transition here. And now I mentioned in my opening remarks that I confessed to being a historian. Now I'm going to put my historian's hat on more firmly, and we're going to go back a little bit here. Okay, and I'm going to remind us of our high school history lessons. And remember, now we're going back to the pre-modern period. Okay? And this is a rough description or a rough illustration of what the pre-modern or feudal social and political hierarchy looked like in Europe. Okay? We have a clear pyramid-like hierarchy, right? Peasants and serfs there on the bottom, merchants, farmers, and craftsmen further up, and so forth and so on. And we go higher and higher. We reach the nobility, the monarch, and above all, the Pope and the Church, right, as the source of the greatest authority. Now, where in this pyramid do the Jews belong? I'll answer my own question, since I don't know if we can really sort of do an active Q&A here. The Jews, I don't know if you can you see my cursor?
Yes.
As I move it? Okay, excellent. So Jews, I would say, are largely outside this pyramid, okay? But probably, I would say, overlap with it to some extent here with the merchant class. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Let me go back to our pyramid. Okay, overlap to some extent with the merchant class, but really belong, again, by their own self-perception and by the perception of much of Christian Europe, belong outside this social hierarchy. Okay? Jews play in medieval Europe, certainly leading up to the modern era, particular social and economic roles. Okay? They tend to be international merchants, okay? Because Jews have all sorts of international connections with Jews in other places, also limitations that are placed on Jews in terms of what they are and are not able to do in terms of livelihood. The two most prominent roles that Jews tend to play in medieval Europe is either as international merchants or as moneylenders. Okay? If you recall, the church really forbids Christians to be moneylenders, but moneylenders play an important role. And I could talk at length about the kinds of positions that this places Jews in, of course, and how that shapes their relations with the surrounding Christian society. But again, I'll leave that for later if people want to pursue it. The one thing I want to stress is that as Europe begins to move in the early modern period into mercantilism and then with the development of capitalism, the fact that Jews are positioned as moneylenders will actually put some Jews in an advantageous position, right, as we see the emergence of banks and so forth. And this is where we get the development of some very famous, very wealthy Jewish families, such as the Rothschilds, right, and so forth. This will have an impact on the roles that Jews play as we move into the modern period, into the 19th century, and on their image in European society. Okay? For the moment, I will leave my comments on that at that, however, so as not to run ourselves out of time. And I'm going to leap ahead from the pre-modern period into the modern period. Okay? Remember, as I mentioned, I'm a historian. I know that when my daughters use the word modern, they mean something that appeared maybe in the last 2 days or so. For historians, modern means the last. Well, we argue about this, but for current purposes, let's say the last 200 or even 250 years. Okay. So for our purposes, we can talk mostly about the 19th century. Now, what are some of the things that happened in the 19th century that will help lead us into the emergence of modern Zionism? Okay? So a few things happen. First of all, we have growing interest in what is known as the Orient in Europe in the 19th century. Okay? Important to remember that in the 19th century, when Europeans speak about the Orient, they are mostly talking about what we today call the Near East or the Middle East. Okay? It's less about what we would call today the Far East. Okay? It's that also sometimes. Certainly India, of course, plays an important role, especially in English discourse. But much of the interest in the Orient is focused on the Near East. And we see this in all sorts of manifestations. We have Orientalist art that becomes very popular by the mid-19th century. Artists from all parts of Europe who come to the Middle East and come to the Holy Land with all sorts of interests in painting the kinds of biblical scenes or the light that is afforded by this area. And so, and this is going to spark interest among Jews as well. Okay.
Quick question. I think this is the right time to ask the question of Mark Steenbergen. He's asking it on Facebook, so thank you for that question. He's saying, were there any attempts by or actual Jews who tried or did move to current day Israel before the emergence of the state of Israel, with the Zionist view in mind?
Yes, that's a very important question. The answer is yes. Throughout history, we have certainly individual Jews who will come to the land of Israel either as a pilgrimage. So probably the most famous among these is the medieval Hebrew poet Yehuda Levi, who's perhaps his most famous poem, or his most famous line, right, is a line. He lived in medieval Spain. And he writes, I am in the West and my heart is in the East, right? This is perhaps his most famous line. And in fact, he goes on a pilgrimage. There were others who did it. I should also stress there are some who come to live in the land of Israel. There is a small Jewish community in the land of Israel throughout history. Okay? This is a community that is concentrated in what are known as the 4 holy cities, the 4 sacred cities. Okay? So those 4 sacred cities are Jerusalem, Hebron, Tveria or Tiberias, and Tzfat, okay, up north. The Tzfat community grows especially and becomes important after the expulsion from Spain in 1492. A group of Jewish mystics, Kabbalists, led by somebody known as the Ari. Isaac Luria was his name. They settle in Tzfat, and this becomes an important center of Jewish thought. In fact, I mentioned earlier that we, as historians, we argue about how do we date modernity, right? So some historians would argue that, in fact, an important turning point is 1492, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, and the popularization of what comes to be known as Lurianic Kabbalah in the 16th century. And let me, why do I mention this? This is still, I admit, a somewhat long response, but still a response to the question. In the 15th and 16th centuries, we will see various ideas of a Jewish return to the land of Israel. The most famous of these is the 17th century movement known as Sabbatianism. Okay? It's known as Sabbatianism, named for its leader, a guy by the name of Shabtai Tzvi, okay, who declares himself in the mid-17th century to be the Messiah. And he has this messianic vision based in Lurianic Kabbalah, based in this version of Jewish mysticism that becomes very popular. And he is influential. So Jews, in fact, around the Jewish world, pack up their bags, okay, and prepare to follow Shabtai Tzvi to the land of Israel. Shabtai Tzvi is then captured by the Ottoman authorities, and he is given the choice of either converting to Islam or dying. Okay? And he chooses the option of converting to Islam. This will be, in fact, some scholars will argue, this is an important starting point for Jewish modernity. Because this brings about a profound crisis in Jewish life, because some people, some followers of Shabtai Tzvi will continue to be followers of his, even after his conversion to Islam. Others will say, no, this is proof that he is a false Messiah. For all sorts of reasons, this is a formative crisis. I won't get into the details because I'm suddenly looking at the clock and seeing what our time is like. But so, yes, there are various attempts. And in fact, we can see into the 19th century, and I'll talk about this briefly soon, we have individuals who are known as forerunners of Zionism, right? So individuals who at least raise the idea of a Jewish return. We tend to think of them as forerunners because the social, political, economic conditions are not yet such that they will have a significant following. That will only happen later on in the 19th century. So that's a long answer to the question, but the short answer is yes. There are these ideas, and there are, in fact, various movements and attempts, but it's really only in the mid to late 19th century that we'll see a social base for a significant movement that really is gains social and political momentum. Okay. But I should add, by the way, some of these ideas, in fact, this is somewhat related to the question. Some of the earliest ideas in the 19th century for a Jewish, what comes to be known in some Christian theology as Jewish restoration. We have a current in the 19th century known as restorationist theology in Christian churches, the idea that Jews should be restored to the Holy Land. This actually predates the full emergence of Zionism in the Jewish world. Okay? And some people will certainly argue that this is a very formative influence. Okay? In fact, that's my second point there, right? The restorationist theologies in some Christian churches. By the way, one church in which restorationist theology becomes very influential is the Anglican Church. And this has some explanatory force when we come to see British interest in the Holy Land, and certainly such phenomena as the Balfour Declaration. Right? Some people say that Balfour's upbringing in a theological context that is influenced by restorationist theology has an impact on the Balfour Declaration. Okay, some historians disagree with that and contest that. My inclination is to believe that that does have some influence. Okay, so that's another point that takes place. So we have a changing status of the Holy Land. Fundamentally important to understand this is also the crisis of Jewish life and Jewish culture and Jewish society, both in the diaspora and in the Holy Land itself. Okay, so a quick word on the Holy Land context. I mentioned the small Jewish community in the 4 holy cities, right? That is a community of people who come there to study Jewish sacred texts. Okay? They do not engage in agriculture. How do they actually eat and survive? They survive off of a system known in Hebrew as chalukah, which literally means dispensation. In other words, what they do is they will send emissaries to Jewish communities in the diaspora, mostly Europe, which is where most Jews of the world live at the time, to raise money. So in other words, they live off a kind of charity. Okay? And that system by the 19th century is, first of all, not working very well anymore. And so the Jewish community in Palestine is very poor and facing economic crisis. And it's also coming in for criticism because of the influence of ideas of what is known as physiocratic thought in Europe, a central idea that influences many Jews, the idea of what comes to be known as productivization. In other and other physical employment. So this will be a critique of the Jewish community in the Holy Land, a Jewish critique, as well as a critique of Jewish life in general. Okay? And the crisis of Jewish life, here I need to say a word about the Jewish encounter with modernity. Okay? Probably to this day, the most important text is a text written in the 1970s by a historian by the name of Jacob Katz, called Out of the Ghetto. Right? And the Jews, under the impact of ideas of emancipation and enlightenment, which you can see in the slide there, right? The idea of emancipating the Jews. In fact, let me take a step back here for a moment and talk about, if we remember that hierarchy, that pyramid of the medieval social and political structure, right? Remember, we don't have very centralized states in the Middle Ages. We have all sorts of little principalities and kings with their knights and their round tables, right? We begin to get, in the early modern period, the emergence of the absolutist state, right? Think of Louis XIV, right? L'état c'est moi, right? The idea that the state should have the monopoly, right? As Max Weber will call it in the early 20th century, what characterizes the modern state is the monopoly on the legitimate use of force. Right? This is how Max Weber characterizes it. States emerge and demand a monopoly on the use of force, on the economy. And when that happens, okay, the question arises, what do we do with the Jews who live in this state, right? So if we think again to those different groups scattered in the medieval structure, right? We have the serfs and we have the merchants, and they can all do their own thing to a large extent, right? The state doesn't really mind that. In the modern period, the state does. Okay? One of the phenomena that we see with the emergence of the modern absolutist state is tensions with the nobility, right? The nobility is losing its power, with the church, which is losing its power as the state begins to claim a monopoly on power. And the Jews are a part of this as well, right? The Jews really were their own sort of separate entity to a large extent. Now the question is, as the state becomes centralized, what happens with the Jews? Okay? And this has all sorts of implications. So for example, to give one illustration of this, if I'm a Jewish merchant in medieval Europe, I will probably keep my financial books in my own language, right? Which is Yiddish, in much of Europe, much of the time. Okay, and that's okay. Nobody expects that we should all be speaking the same language. Okay? But now, and remember, by the way, in medieval Europe, the aristocracy and the monarchy, they don't speak the same language as the peasants, and nobody thinks they should. Okay, that will change in the modern era. The aristocracy will speak the same language, say, in France as the aristocracy in Russia, because the divide works that way. It's a class divide more than a locality or a national divide.
And it has everything to do with nation building, right?
Exactly. And so this comes back to the question about nationalism and nationhood. Okay, but hang on, I'm not quite there yet. But the state will now, as it begins to become more absolute and begins to become more national, okay, the question, as I say, arises, well, what happens with the Jews? And there are various possibilities, right? We could expel the Jews. That's one possibility. And in some places, that's a viable possibility. But it's a difficult possibility and not always a desirable possibility for all sorts of reasons. And we also have the impact of Enlightenment thought and Enlightenment rationalism, which tells us that fundamentally people are the same. Okay? Enlightenment thought also comes with the notion of what is known as natural religion, okay? The idea that we really are all praying to the same God. Okay? This is a new idea in the late 18th century. And these various factors, the social and economic factors and the philosophical factor, come together to make the idea of emancipation a powerful idea in Europe. What is the idea of emancipation? The idea is we grant Jews equal rights. We emancipate them. Okay? And this begins to take place, and we can see these things coming together, crystallizing very clearly in post-revolutionary France. Right? The French Revolution essentially invents the idea of the nation state. It almost invents the idea of the nation state. It's really one of our first examples of a nation state, right? What does that mean? In other words, the sovereignty of the state does not belong to the king who gets it by divine right, right? The sovereignty belongs to the nation, to the citizens, right? The French Revolution really virtually invents the idea of citizenship. And for 2 years after the revolution, the French parliament debates what to do with the Jews. And in 1791, 2 years after the revolution, the Jews of France are granted citizenship. They are made to be Frenchmen. Okay? And this is a first, and for many, many Jews, of course, a very welcome development. But it's also a development that will lead to a significant crisis of identity. Fundamentally, what is the crisis of identity? It's based on the notion that, well, if I am now French by nationhood, well, what does it mean for me to be Jewish today? And is it worthwhile to be Jewish today? Why should I bother? So if you had gone to a Jewish individual in the 13th century, okay, living in some part of France, that makes you Jewish, that person would probably look at you with very strange eyes and say, well, what are you talking about? It's just who I am. Everything about me is how I eat. It's the language I marry, right? Everything about me is Jewish. By the time we reach the 19th century, you will be very hard pressed to find a Jew in Europe who is not asking him or herself, well, what is it that makes me Jewish today? And should I bother? So this is the crisis of modernity in a nutshell. For Jews, by the way, modernity is a crisis pretty much for everybody for various reasons that I won't get into at the moment. It hits the Jewish community with even greater force than it hits others. Okay? So the combination of emancipation, and I would add to that social integration. So in many parts of Europe, by the middle of the 19th century, Jews are integrated into European societies in a way they never had been before. So by the mid-19th century, Jews are living among non-Jews and look much like non-Jews. Many of them are eating and behaving like non-Jews and speaking the languages of non-Jews. Okay? So we have unprecedented levels of social integration, legal and political emancipation, Enlightenment thought that tells us that essentially we're pretty much all alike. Okay? Nationalism now, which tells us we are members of the nation and the state. What is the fundamental political idea of nationalism? Is that the human group known as the nation and the political body known as the state should be coordinated, there should be a confluence between them, right? That the state should be the manifestation of the human body known as the nation. Okay? That was not the case in Europe, right? I remind us all, it really only becomes the case throughout much of Europe after the First World War. Right? Up until the end of the First World War, much of Europe is not divided into nation states. It's divided either into multinational empires, right, such as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and so forth, the Ottoman Empire, or into small principalities. Right?
Yeah, it's very good that you mentioned that, because since we live in this day and age, we think in terms of nation states and that you share the same language, but these things were different back in the days.
That's right. And it's really under the impact of nationalism that we think we should share the same language. I can tell you, by the way, on a personal anecdote here, I can tell you that my wife is originally from Italy. And when we go to Italy, when we sit down with her parents' generation, and you can tell me if there's a similar situation to this in Holland as well, right? With her parents' generation, I have a hard time understanding what's going on because they are not actually speaking Italian. Right? They amongst themselves, they speak Bolognese, okay, the Bologna dialect. And so, in fact, in Italy at least, the linguistic nationalization of the nation takes place very late. It's really my wife's generation where it really comes in full force. There's a famous Italian nationalist, right, who after the unification of Italy, a guy by the name of Massimo d'Azeglio, in 1860 or 61, he very famously says, right, we've now created Italy, now we need to create Italians, right? Italians did not think of themselves until certainly the mid-19th century, and we can point today to political parties that exist in today's Italy that still talk about secession of the North, right? For example, the nationhood, the idea of the nation state is quite new and sometimes still shaky. Yeah,
that is the case in the Netherlands. My parents-in-law, they speak Neder-Saxisch, so in Dutch it would be plat, and they're very proud that that's an actual language. But amongst ourselves, we speak Dutch. Yeah,
sure.
I think a lot of our listeners will notice, and they will think of Gronings or Fries or
So the idea that we should all speak the same language, of course, begins to emerge even in the late 18th century and becomes powerful in the 19th. And we begin to see these things happening and efforts by the state to get everybody to speak the same language, right? But it really only happens in the 20th century, and even then, not fully, as you just mentioned, Jos, right? But the idea is certainly there. Okay, so all of these factors, and then with all of this, we need to add what I said in the beginning of my remarks, right? It is an insufficient, but nevertheless, it is an important part of the picture, and that is modern racial anti-Semitism. And why do I stress the racial aspect of anti-Semitism? I remind us all, or I don't know if we all know this, right? The word anti-Semitism itself is a modern word, right? We can pinpoint exactly when it emerges. It is invented by a German journalist by the name of Wilhelm Marr in 1873. And its purpose is to stress that, Wilhelm Marr, I am not some kind of prejudiced medieval fool. I'm a modern, scientific, enlightened individual. And it's, I don't have religious prejudice against Jews. I have scientific reason, racial scientific reason. And we need to remember that in the 19th century, race science is considered legitimate science in many circles. We forget this because today, of course, it is pseudoscience. But in the late 19th century, it really is legitimate science. And not even, also an important point, not everybody who accepts the premises of race science in the 19th century is necessarily a racist, okay? But Wilhelm Marr is, and he coins the term anti-Semitism to say, okay, I have a problem with Jews not because of some kind of medieval religious prejudice, but for modern scientific racial reasons. Okay, one quick word. We could spend a long time discussing the differences and similarities between pre-modern anti-Judaism and modern anti-Semitism. We won't spend a long time discussing it. I'll just point out this one important difference, and this is the racial element. Okay? So in pre-modern anti-Judaism, at least in theory, it didn't always work in practice, but in theory, there was an easy way out, right? I could go be baptized, become Christian, and then I'm okay. In modern racial anti-Semitism, I can be baptized 13 times a day, and there is nothing that can wash it off. I cannot wash away my Jewishness. Okay? And this is a very important aspect that will also change Jews' self-perception and their position in European societies. I'm going to skip over some of my slides because I see we're going to run out of time shortly, and I do want to leave some time for some concentrated question and answer. So I'm going to zip through some of these. Okay? I mentioned Jewish integration, and we can see here Napoleon, and France, of course, is one of the key places where we, on the one hand, have emancipation, on the other hand, tensions and responses and reactions against emancipation, but I won't get into great depth in that. Here again, then, the rise of modern anti-Semitism, and we can see some of the imagery associated with it. Some of these are covers from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which in the early 20th century becomes a key formative text, which adds the element not only, of course, of the racial inescapable element, but also to control the world. I'm going to skip over some of this. That's too much text. In any case, I'll in a nutshell, say the following. All of these aspects of modernity that I've discussed begin, as I mentioned, they lead to a crisis of Jewish society and Jewish identity. And we get all sorts of responses in the Jewish world, right? So one response, for example, is religious reform, right? So early Reform Judaism, one of its main goals, it emerges largely in German lands, and its main goal is to wipe away any mention of return to Jerusalem or any notion of Jewish nation, right? Because now, according to the ideology, we are Germans of the Mosaic faith. Right? In other words, we maintain our Jewish religious identity, but we're not a separate nation. I don't want to go to Palestine. Why should I go to Palestine? Berlin is lovely. And I am now accepted as a German. Okay, so religious reform is one response. Another response, which is also a response to that response, okay, is the emergence of Jewish orthodoxy. And so the ideology of Orthodox Judaism is that what we do is exactly what Jews have been doing forever and ever. But of course, there is no one thing that Jews have been doing forever and ever. The idea, as the Khatam Sofer, the important thinker of Orthodox Judaism, put it, the Hebrew is Chadash Asur min HaTorah. Anything new is forbidden by the Torah, by the Jewish law. In fact, that is a very new idea, and it is a response to Reform Judaism. So we get all sorts of responses, including Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, diaspora nationalism, and I won't get into details with all of these. The important thing to remember is that Zionism will be, to a large extent, also a response to the crisis of Jewish responses, okay, to previous Jewish responses. And here we come to the emergence of Zionism itself. Okay, so we get a confluence of Jewish messianic traditions, modern nationalism, and a set of prescriptions that are conceived as remedies to this thing known by the 19th century as the Jewish problem or the Jewish question. Okay? And very quickly, let me just say that there are at least two different versions of what the Jewish question is. And by the 19th century, everybody's talking about the Jewish question. Okay? There is the question that the state asks itself, which I mentioned earlier. Well, what do we do with this group that to some extent seems like a state within the state? Jewish states we can't tolerate that there would be a separate court system or something, right? The state demands a monopoly. What do we do with that? So that's one version of the Jewish. Well, how do we make sense of being Jewish today? And should we bother? Okay? So everybody's talking about the Jewish question, and various ideas emerge. Among them, we have the emergence of some ideas of a Jewish return to the land of Israel. The critical turning point will come in 1881, and this is after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in Russia, when the wave of anti-Jewish pogroms that emerges there, and we will get a response which will come to be known as Chidov of Zion. And this is really the first moment of Jew. And is based on an analysis of anti-Semitism. I won't get into it. More important for our current discussion is his idea that Jews must recognize themselves as a nation and must therefore establish a territorial base. Okay? The Jewish abnormality is that Jews are a nation that does not have a territorial home, according to Pinsker. Right? I'm going to skip ahead to some other central tenets. There is a tension. So Pinsker says we need a territorial base. He doesn't say that that territorial base needs to be in Palestine, land of Israel. It could be somewhere else. And one can be a Zionist up until 1905 and hold that that territorial base might be somewhere else, perhaps Argentina, perhaps East Africa. Okay? After 1905, Zionism means exclusively the land of Israel. I mean, we can talk about what happens in 1905 to make that happen, but I'll leave that for the moment. Now, by 1896, so about a decade and a half after Pinsker, the same Theodor Herzl, whom I mentioned earlier, who's been searching for a number of years for how to understand his Jewishness and comes up with all sorts of ideas. In 1896, he will publish his famous tract known as Der Judenstaat, often translated into English as the Jewish state, but it really should be better translated as the state of the Jews. There's an important difference there. And we will get the emergence of full-fledged Zionism, which will have various different schools of thought within it: cultural Zionism, political Zionism, practical Zionism, labor Zionism, religious Zionism, revisionist Zionism. I won't talk about all these distinctions. I do want to skip ahead here.
But it's good to know that these distinctions are there.
Yes, and I am going to try and finish my talk in the next few minutes so that we leave some time for some concentrated Q&A. Just very quickly, a year after he publishes Der Judenstaat, Herzl will convene the first Zionist Congress, which I mentioned before. So in other words, he is not only a visionary of the Jewish state as he is remembered, but he really establishes some important institutions that will help to become some of the foundations of the state ultimately. We can see here some of the imagery of Herzl as a new Moses, right? If we had more time, I'd talk about this at greater length. But I do want to come here to this distinction here very quickly between political Zionism and cultural Zionism. Okay? Political Zionism, the Zionism of Theodor Herzl, addresses the problem of the Jews largely. In other words, the difficulties of legal emancipation, of economic and social emancipation that individual Jews face. The major competitor is cultural Zionism, okay, led principally by this guy here, known as Ahad Ha'am, because this was his pen name. His real name was Asher Ginsburg. And he understands Zionism not as a solution to the problem of the Jews, but as a solution to the problem of Judaism. In other words, as he puts it, not only did the Jews come out of the ghetto under the impact of modernity, but Judaism, Jewish culture came out of the ghetto, encountered the surrounding European culture and entered its own crisis. And the task of Zionism, according to Ahad Ha'am, is to create a viable Jewish culture for the modern age. Okay? And again, we can elaborate on this to some extent in our Q&A. The fundamental motif that is shared by both of these, okay, is both of them seek to undo exile, and at least in many cases, to offer a different vision, a vision of redemption, a redemptive vision, various visions of redemption. Okay. And I just want to illustrate that. You can see it here in this visual, right, the exile of Egypt, with the rising sun of the east, again, going back to the theme of Mizrach, right? Mizrach is east, I remind us in Hebrew. The rising sun of the east with the word Zion, Zion written on it. And this is a motif that repeats itself again and again in Zionist imagery. Again, we can see on the left, sort of mournful Jews, in this case, at the Western Wall, right, representing the destruction of the temple. And a Jew planting the seeds of rebirth here in this depiction. And so now, very quick comment. How does Zionism then move from these ideas of undoing exile and offering redemption to the very, these are four central aspects of Zionist praxis over the course mostly of the 20th century. First of all, immigration, right? The premise of Zionism was that Jews need to change where they live. A very small percentage of Jews actually lived in the land of Israel, so Jews needed to immigrate, settle, create new settlements, and in fact, create new forms of settlement, such as the kibbutz, right? Diplomatic activity, which Herzl initiated to gain international recognition, and cultural activity to create this modern Hebrew culture, which, as I mentioned in the beginning of my remarks, to me is perhaps one of the most miraculous of the achievements. Again, I'm going to comment just on those things briefly so that we have some more time for question and answer. I'm going to skip over some of these aspects of the landscape in which this takes place for lack of time. We can see here, again, this relates to the question of nationalism. By the way, European nationalisms often had athletic and gymnastics associations related with them. Zionism is no different. We need to remember that the image of the Jew in 19th into the 20th century was as the Jew was depicted as old, weak, bent over. And so one of Zionism's goals is to create a new Jew, right? What Max Nordau will call it, the Second Zionist Congress, muscle Judaism. And there are various images. There are various images of the new Jew. Some of them compete with others. And I'll just give you some visual indications of what some of those are. Often, many of them you can see here at the same time, competing images of the new Jew here. I'm going to skip over some of this, and I'm going to end very well the Balfour Declaration, which we could talk about for the next 3 hours. We won't. 1917, of course, key turning point that is both a diplomatic moment, but also allows for the implementation in an unprecedented way of the other aspects of Zionist praxis, right? So this diplomatic achievement allows for unprecedented numbers of immigrants to come to Palestine, of course, after British conquest, settlement and cultural activity, as Hebrew, for example, is now under the British mandate recognized as an official language. Okay, so the Balfour Declaration plays a wide range of roles. I will skip over some of the various partition proposals that we have. I'll just come to this, of course, formative moment. We've skipped over decades of history here, right? Of course, May 14th of 1948, the Declaration of Independence, the establishment of the state, and in some sense, the fulfillment of these decades of Zionist activity. But I want to come to my last slide and suggest that it's really only, to some extent, a partial fulfillment, not a necessary but partial fulfillment. And we can turn to a figure like Ben-Gurion, more strongly associated with Israeli statehood than Ben-Gurion, right? And even for him, right, it's he who here in this previous slide, right, it's he who declares independence, right? But even for him, statehood is not miraculous. Okay, I think we're back.
We're back.
The most obvious example of this is a thinker by the name of Aharon David Gordon, who envisions even a cosmic redemption that is a part of this. Okay, so I will end there. I might have lost you at least for a few moments, but if people are still with me, Jos, are we here?
Yes, people are with you. I just canceled my camera because my connection is unstable. Can you hear me loud and clear?
Yes, I can. Do you want to sort of field questions for us?
Yes, firstly, I want to thank you so much for this inspirational talk and your energy that you put in. Thank you so much. Just two quick questions for you before we go to the Q&A. Firstly, what is, if there's one thing that you want to that you want our listeners to remember tomorrow, what is that one thing? Because we skipped a few things and we highlighted a few things. What would you highlight now?
So I would say two things, okay, or maybe three things. Allow me three. First of all, and I'll put these in sort of non-academic terms. So you know, I'll take my historian's hat off here for a moment, although it's historically related. Really, the to me amazing, almost miraculous nature of this profound transformation and the revolutionary transformation that Zionism does in fact bring about in Jewish life. It's hard for us today, you know, you mentioned, Jos, we live in an age of nation states. It's hard for us to remember that that's a fairly recent phenomenon. Another thing that's very hard for us to remember is what it was like to be a Jew in the early 20th century, for example. It was not a happy situation. Zionism sets out to revolutionize Jewish life And I think it does so in some very dramatic and very striking ways, not always the ways that were intended, okay? And perhaps not all of them ways that we might always be happy with. But it certainly revolutionizes Jewish life. So that's one thing I would like to take away from this. Another thing that I think is important to stress here, we hear a great deal about Zionism today in media and in academia, and Zionism is often cast as, in all sorts of terms, as racist, as imperialist, as colonialist. I have to say that certainly in my understanding of Zionism, it is none of those. It is a movement that emerges out of a deep distress of Jewish life and seeks to be a liberationist movement. We can point to all sorts of mistakes and even injustices that happen along the way, but the fundamental idea of a Jewish revival and this vision of redemption, I think, is one that we could actually learn a great deal from in our current political reality in the world today. We would do well to, and this really is my third point, that is that as much as statehood is an indispensable, and in a world in which nation states are the reality, statehood is an indispensable much of the time, the ultimate end. The ultimate end is something much bigger, which again, I think we would do well to recall in a day and age in which so much of politics is focused on, politicians' self-interest and so forth. We would do well to remember these very ambitious visions that inform much of Zionist thought and activity.
Thank you so much for stressing that point, because we wanted to start this seminar series with Zionism, because this is a term that sometimes sounds negative in ears of people, but it shouldn't be.
That's right.
Second short question, if you want to answer it, you don't have to, but would you consider yourself a Zionist?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer it. The answer is yes. I absolutely see myself as a Zionist. I can also look critically at Zionism. Eric Hobsbawm, who's an important 20th century historian and somebody very unsympathetic to Zionism, writes in his book on nations and nationalism, he says, we can't expect a Zionist to write a legitimate history of legitimate history of the Jews. I think he's wrong. Of course, Eric Hobsbawm, who was a socialist, allowed himself to write a history of socialism, right? We can, and this is the trick we have as academics, right? And it's a challenge that we always have to deal with, is to have our own ideological and political commitments, and at the same time, however, to be able to think about those commitments critically. And so there are aspects of Zionist history that I'm less happy with, but I think overall Zionism has much to be proud of. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains painful. But I have to say, I think when we think about the history of the conflict, we would do well to look at both sides of that conflict and not just one of them.
Yeah, let's not throw it all in the bin.
Yeah,
just because you're critical doesn't mean there's nothing in it.
Exactly. We want to look at it in an adult, mature way. Right? We can be critical of aspects and not throw the whole thing away, as you say, Jos. And there is not only not throw the whole thing away, there is much that is tremendously valuable that we should learn from.
There's a question here, and the question is, what is your answer to those who label Zionism as imperialism?
Yeah, there are all sorts of answers. Of course, it's a whole separate lecture, and in fact, a series of lectures. There are a few things we can say about it. First of all, the obvious answer is, most imperialisms require a metropole, right? A mother state to send the colonists out. Zionism does not have that. Okay? So some people will then argue that Zionism is then a form of settler colonialism. Now, by the way, I should say, you know, Zionism operates in a reality in which imperialism is a powerful force, and colonialism and colonization, by the way, we should not be confused, because colonialism and colonization are similar words but different phenomena. But Zionism, of course, does adopt aspect. Perhaps the best article on this is an article by the historian Derek Penslar called Zionism, Colonialism, and Imperialism, where he looks at some of the ways in which Zionism did adopt some of the praxis and some of the ideas of colonization projects, but also some of the important ways in which it is very different from those. So when we look at it critically, you know, these are contexts in which we should understand Zionism and adopt some of the practices, but the goals and the fundamental nature of the project is very, very different. Let me add one other comment to this. You know, here it goes to another question. And that is the question, you know, it is often cast as, you know, Zionism is cast in these contexts as a project of Europeans coming and displacing a native population. But that, of course, assumes that Jews themselves are not indigenous to this place. Now, Zionism, at least, certainly assumes that Jews are basically indigenous to this land and are returning to it, right? A great example of this is the speech given by the Hebrew author Shai Agnon when he was awarded the Nobel Prize for literature. And he begins his speech by saying, you know, by some accident of history in which Titus destroyed Jerusalem, right, I was born in one of the lands of exile, but I always saw myself as somebody who was born in Jerusalem. This is how Jews thought of themselves throughout the centuries. You know, I have to say, I can be critical of some aspects of that, but fundamentally, I think this is at least as legitimate a claim to indigeneity as many other claims to indigeneity.
You see that all those questions require, especially from a historian, a broader answer. Thanks for keeping it short as well, so that we can try and answer as much questions as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for keeping me short, Jos.
I'm trying, but you're doing a pretty good job as well. A question about the Holocaust, sadly. Did the Holocaust impact the balance between the heavenly and earthly Jerusalems? A question that came in the beginning, but I wanted to save for the end.
Yeah. So hang on, before I answer that question, I noticed in the chat somebody asked me, is Zionism really decolonization? And in many senses, to continue my previous answer very briefly, I think as much as we can talk about some adoption of practices from colonialism, absolutely. We can also talk about ways in which it is an anti-colonial and a movement and part of a process of decolonization. As to the Holocaust, I don't know. It's an interesting question, which I would need to think about if the Holocaust has an impact on shaping the relationship between the heavenly and the earthly lands of Israel. It's a very interesting question. Certainly the Holocaust, of course, has an impact on Zionism in a wide range of ways. By the way, one takeaway that I hope people will have from this talk also is that Zionism is by no means a response to the Holocaust, right? It emerges long before the Holocaust. But the Holocaust has an important impact on Zionist practice and praxis, and on some Zionist ideas. So if it has an impact, and this is really an initial answer to the question, if it has an impact on the relationship between the heavenly and the earthly, I would say that that impact is to be found in the added stress that is given to in fact, a sense of urgency to the physical land of Israel, right, as a refuge for the survivors of the Holocaust. But that's a complicated question, and I don't think I've given it a sufficient answer But yes, I think it does create an added sense of urgency to the notion of Zionism as offering a physical refuge to Jews.
Yeah, there's a lot of people still in the Q&A, so thank you so much for asking your questions and keeping staying with us. Let's answer two questions. Firstly, a question by Rishi, a very I just want to express that I'm thankful for Rishi that he's here. His question, is socialist Zionism still around because in leftist spaces it's not tolerated to be socialist and Zionist? They think it's mutually exclusive.
Right. Yeah, good question. And I see Rishi also asked about Ben-Gurion's relationship with Stalin and the USSR, also a very interesting question. So first of all, socialist Zionism is by no means the powerful force that it once was. Okay, so socialist Zionism was the dominant form of Zionism, I would say, between the 1930s, certainly. You could even say it's beginning to become dominant in the 1920s, and up until the 1970s, up until 1977, right, when the Labour Party is, for the first time in Israeli history, voted out of power. Today, there is socialist Zionism, but excuse me. But at this point, it is very much a minority within the Zionist world. But it's there. You know, I live 3 kilometers away from a kibbutz, Kibbutz de Boker. By the way, the kibbutz to which Ben-Gurion retired in 1953.
Oh, wow.
And it is very much still a socialist kibbutz, and a Zionist kibbutz, of course. So yes, socialist Zionism is there. There are socialist Zionist youth movements.
But is it mutually exclusive?
They are certainly not mutually exclusive.
Exactly.
As I say, socialist Zionism was the dominant form of Zionism for many decades. Now, let me quickly respond to the question of Stalin and the Soviet Union. Labor Zionism was divided historically over this issue. Some labor Zionists, certainly in the immediate wake of the Russian Revolution, were very sympathetic. In fact, there were some, you know, the further left elements of labor Zionism. Some people after the revolution left Palestine and returned to the Soviet Union, right, because they thought that that was where the socialist utopia was being created. Up until the 1950s, there is a tension between Mapai, which is the Workers' Party of the Land of Israel, Ben-Gurion's party, which is not pro-Soviet. Okay? So Israeli foreign policy tries to remain somewhat neutral, but for example, in the Korean War, okay, really the state of Israel comes very close to supporting the Americans rather than the Soviets, okay? But there is another very strong party known as Mapam, the Socialist Labor Party, right, which also has a kibbutz movement associated with it, which is pro-Soviet. I have somewhere in my basement photocopies of, you know, in Israel, when somebody dies, it is customary to print these mourning announcements, okay? So in 1953, when Stalin dies, circles associated with Mapam print these mourning announcements about the death of the, you know, the liberator of nations and so forth. And it's really Mapam then, under Khrushchev's revelations about what had happened, what had taken place under Stalin, Mapam enters crisis. Okay, so there are socialist Zionist groups that are sympathetic to the Soviet Union, but the dominant socialist Zionism, Ben-Gurion socialist Zionism, is not.
Right. The question of Albert ter Hamsel, a really nice Dutch name. You started with the paradox that traditional Jews did not immigrate to Palestine. Zionism was more or less secular, not religious. How did religious Jews change their minds on immigration to Palestine? Is there a good book on this topic?
Yeah, an excellent question, and the premise is absolutely correct. So from the early days, there is something called religious Zionism, but religious Zionism early on is a double minority. It's a minority in the Zionist context, because the Zionist context, as you say, is almost, the vast majority are secular Jews. And it's also a minority in the religious and the Jewish Orthodox world, because much of Orthodox Judaism, early on is anti-Zionist. Okay, and I could talk about why that's the case, but that's a long story. So unless people want to stick around for that, I won't yet. But so there is religious Zionism. As I say, it's a minority position within Zionism. It gains followers over the course of the 20th century. The establishment of the state gives it some strength because for some religious Zionists, the establishment of the state is seen in redemptive terms. Okay, so if I focus, on the book that I mentioned, and in my argument here, I focus really on the secular visions of redemption, but there is a religious version of that, of course. And the key turning point, to give you a brief answer, the most important turning point in that regard is 1967 with the Six-Day War, when holy sites, many of the key holy sites, including the old city of Jerusalem and so forth, after 1948, are not in the state of Israel, they're in Jordan. After 1967, they come into the possession of the state of Israel, and this gives great momentum to a messianic religious Zionist current, which at this point is probably at least one of the most dominant forces in Israeli politics, if not the most dominant force in Israeli politics today. And there's a very different kind of redemptive vision than the kind that I've been talking about and the kind that I focus on in my book. It's a competitor in many senses. Personally, I can confess it's a vision that I'm not happy about, but it certainly becomes a powerful force. The best book about these tensions and interactions is a book by a scholar by the name of Aviezer Ravitsky. The English version is called something like Zionism, Messianism, and Jewish religious something. I forget the exact title in English. It's originally in Hebrew.
You had to dug very deep there, yeah.
Sorry?
You had to dug very deep there, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful book. Yeah, he's a wonderful scholar. Last name again is Ravitsky, Ravitzy, worth reading.
All right, let's wrap this up. Thank you so much for keeping it brief. All these big questions, so hard to answer shortly, and make it personal as well. And I learned a lot. Thank you so much. And thanks to all the participants today for sticking around. The next one is February 16th. So make sure you'll be there. We're going to talk about Turkey's quiet revolution and its impact on Israel. Very interesting country in the Middle East. And of course, the bridge between the Middle East and ourselves here in Europe. Secondly, if you want the PDFs or the PowerPoints, just mail to cd@cd.nl, and I'll make sure you'll get it, if that's okay with the professor here.
Yeah, that's okay. I'll send you my updated version of it, Jos.
Yes, please.
Let me also just say, Jos, thank you for coordinating this so well. And thanks for the wonderful questions.
Until next time, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.